Clive Staples Lewis, or C.S. Lewis, is probably the most famous and influential Anglican Christian of modern times. He died on the same day that President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. He was a professor of medieval English at Oxford University. He's most famous now for his fiction writings, including the Chronicles of Narnia series, widely read and loved, now made into a series of movies. His short book, Mere Christianity, originally a series of short radio talks in which he defends what he considers the basic claims of the Christian faith and commends them as worthy of belief even in these modern times. He wrote many other things as well, which are still read by Christians. And he was a friend of the author of the Lord of the Rings series, J.R.R. Tolkien. They used to drink beer in the pub together and talk about their ideas with some other guys. In an autobiographical writing, C.S. Lewis describes his conversion in very rich terms. You see, when he was young, he was an atheist. But at a certain point in his life, he felt that God was pursuing him, that God was chasing him. He was trying to push God away. He said he was feeling, quote, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet, end quote. Finally, he gives in to God. He feels he was compelled by God, unable to do otherwise. And yet, still, when he gave in to God, that was a free action. Speaking of God, Lewis says, quote, his compulsion is our liberation, end quote. And he says, quote, I felt as if I were a man of snow, at long last beginning to melt. I rather disliked the feeling, end quote. And after his conversion, he found that his conscience had become a lot more sensitive. He says, quote, for the first time I examined myself and found a zoo of lusts, a bedlam of ambitions, a nursery of fears, a harem of fondled hatreds. My name was Legion, end quote. He's referring there to an incident in the Gospels where Jesus is confronting a demon-possessed man, and when he wants to know which demons are in there, the demons say, we are legion. In other words, there's too many of them there to name. What Lewis is saying is that when he looked into his own heart, when he looked into his own soul, he found a whole bunch of bad things. He doesn't mean literal demons, but a whole bunch of negative emotions and bad habits, controlling desires, ambitions, fears, hatreds. He describes his conversion also as a total surrender and an absolute leap in the dark. Another interesting current-day Christian is the Quaker theologian, writer, and professor Richard Foster. Richard Foster is best known for his 1978 book, which has gone through many editions, called The Celebration of Discipline. A discipline here just means a spiritually helpful practice, something that one does regularly, not for the sake just of doing it, but because it helps one to grow spiritually. Disciplines include being alone, being quiet, fasting, that is not eating, in some cases not eating or drinking, reading scripture. He wrote another book on prayer, and one thing he's discussed is his belief in healing prayer. Christians vary widely on how much they believe in healing prayer. Jesus heals people through prayer, and so do the apostles in the book Acts of the Apostles. Among liberal Christians, they tend to have a naturalistic outlook. They tend to not believe in miracles, and if they pray for the sick, they tend to pray just that God will comfort them in their sickness. Some Catholics, some evangelical Christians, and other Christians are exactly the same way, even though they're not from liberal traditions. Other Christians do practice healing prayer, in particular Pentecostals. Pentecostalism is a movement that started in the early 1900s, in the early 20th century, and they believe in miracles, and they do believe that one can pray and receive miraculous healing. Also, the African indigenous churches usually practice healing prayer. Most Christians, not all, but most Christians don't understand this to be magic. It's not as if you can just say a certain formula, say certain words in a certain order, and then it'll automatically work. They think that the sick person isn't made well by the person praying, but rather by God. And it's always up to God whether he's going to comply or not. However, there are some Christians in what's called the faith movement, or the Word of Faith movement, and this includes many Pentecostals, who teach that if someone is not healed, it's always due to their lack of faith. So then they do seem to be viewing it as something automatic. That if you really do everything right, it'll work every time. Jesus does seem to have taught that faith is required. There's even an incident in which it said that Jesus was unable to heal because of other people's lack of faith. Our third recent influential Christian is Pope John Paul II, a very popular traditionalist Polish pope. Since the legalization of abortion in the United States and elsewhere, traditional Roman Catholics have been much concerned with abortion and have been leaders, along with other sorts of traditional Christians, such as evangelicals, in the pro-life movement. We could add that in tension with the leadership of Roman Catholicism, many lay Catholics, many ordinary Catholic people in the U.S. are pro-choice. In his famous statement, Evangelium Vitae, the good news of life, Pope John Paul asserts that abortion and infanticide are unspeakable crimes. Infanticide is the practice of killing a baby that's already been born. You could call infanticide a post-birth abortion. The idea may shock you, but it's been practiced in many cultures and many times and places. It's hardly an unheard of practice. Human life, he asserts, begins at conception. And he says, quote, I declare that direct abortion, that is, abortion willed as an end or as a means, always constitutes a grave moral disorder, since it is the deliberate killing of an innocent human being, end quote. What he's saying is that that sort of action is intrinsically wrong and is never in any circumstances morally right. In favor of this, he cites, quote, a doctrinal and disciplinary tradition which is unchanged and unchangeable, end quote. That's a little bit misleading. There have been times and places that early abortions were allowed in the Roman Catholic tradition, although one famous early writing from the 2nd century, called the Didache, says in one place, do not murder a child by abortion or kill a newborn infant. At some times in Catholic history, they've thought that life begins somewhat after conception. Therefore, if you abort before that point, you're not actually killing anyone. It's not entirely clear here, but what he says is leaving the door open for, quote, indirect abortion. This is where killing the fetus is a foreseen but unintended consequence of a procedure. That is, an unaffected side effect of it. So, for example, in the difficult circumstance of an ectopic pregnancy, a woman may undergo surgery to remove her fallopian tubes. That, of course, will result in taking out the fetus and killing the fetus, but that would be permissible under his rule here. Or if a woman has uterine cancer during pregnancy, they may have to remove the cancerous womb. In so doing, they may take out the fetus, but that would be permitted by this rule. It wasn't done for the sake or the purpose of killing the fetus. It was done for the purpose of saving the mother's life. Nor was the killing of the fetus even willed as a means. So in effect, this allows abortions in cases where the abortion is implied by some measure taken to save the mother's life. Seemingly, this wouldn't permit abortion in cases of rape or incest or emotional harm to the woman, or even probably in a somewhat risky pregnancy. On that controversial note, we end our survey of the Christian traditions. In our next lecture, 6 more classic theories of religion that you should know about, and after that, Islam.